Alright, looks like we're recording. Official. And where did we end up last time? We ended up somewhere in I think we finished chapter 1, didn't we? Kind of.
Very close.
At the end of chapter 1, we just kind of quickly talked about planning out our lives, planning out our days in school, planning out our day in our work week, planning out things. Just doing a lot of planning. And in section 1.5, they mention how many of these things? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 things that we should think about in our lives to become a good engineer and successful in life in general. One of them is network, so get to know people. Foster relationships, because they can help you later on. They can help you to find jobs, opportunities, other things like this. Exploring, right? So exploring means don't end your education when you leave the classroom. Don't end your education when you leave college. Always look for those new things to learn. Learn to write well. That's extremely important, of course. You can do a lot of writing as an engineer, and many people do a lot of writing. Learn to reason well. Logic is extremely important, so you don't make bad turns in your ideas. Distinguish grades from learning. Of course, many colleges put a big emphasis on grades and your grade point average and everything else. And they are important because they do reflect how much work you're putting into your courses, how much you're learning in some way, hopefully. But they're not everything. Sometimes you may struggle with a subject, or you may not be able to put as much time into a subject as you would like for some reason or another. And grades are not everything. You can accomplish good things without being a straight A student. So try not to put too much emphasis on it. Be well-rounded. Seek out those things that will expand your interests, expand your abilities and your talents. Read. Can't tell you how important this is. Most people never read a book after they leave college. And if you do that as an engineer or really as anything else, your life will be stunted. So read. Don't just read science magazines or science articles or engineering articles or engineering books. That'll just bore you to death. Read some other things too. There's lots of great nonfiction, lots of great fiction out there. Read good books and enjoy them. Plan your first job interview. It's not a bad idea to not only plan your first job interview, but to actually rehearse it so that you remember the key points, so that you get used to answering questions on the fly. When you go into an interview, they don't necessarily ask the same questions from interview to interview, and you have to have answers for a wide variety of things. And really, for me, interviews, I usually end up adapting the things that I want to say to their questions. It really has very little to do with the questions they're asking sometimes. It has to do with the answers I want to give. And it's important also to find out something about who you're interviewing with. I had an interview a couple of years ago. A guy came into town and he was looking for a physicist that had some background kind of like mine. And he called me in and I did some research before I went in to figure out what it is he was doing with his company, the kind of things he was looking for. And he offered me a job on the spot. I wasn't really interested in the job that he was offering, so I didn't take it. But you can learn a lot before you even get into the interview, and that way you can guide your thought processes towards that interview. Make 1,000 friends. We're not talking necessarily about friends on Facebook. Okay? Making 1,000 friends does not just apply to friends you meet in college, does not just apply to professional friends, it applies to being somebody who can make friends. Being the kind of person who can work well with others, who can greet others easily, who can have good conversations in just about any situation. It will make you a more effective human being in general, and that, of course, will help you in your work. Take time for dating, right? Don't just do engineering. You're going to have enough of that anyway. If you dedicate yourselves to nothing but engineering or nothing but your schooling, you certainly will probably get good grades, but the well-roundedness part of your life will be lacking seriously. And also, the mind and the body need to get out and away from things. You can't just constantly do the same thing over and over again, or you will wear yourself out. Exercise iron discipline. So you need to kind of decide what you're doing with your life, and not be wishy-washy and not just kind of do it halfway. At some point, you need to decide what you want to do. Once you have decided that, then you need to set goals, you need to set limits, you need to set all kinds of things. And you need to stick to those things. You need to really be true to those things. Sometimes it takes a year for somebody to figure that out. Sometimes it takes a few years. But don't finish college without having goals in mind, without having a path in mind. If you do, you will end up wandering and having a very unfulfilling life, almost guaranteed. So that is the end of chapter 1. It just kind of sums up all the things we've talked about to become a successful engineering student, a successful engineer, and a successful person in general. It's quite important stuff. There is some homework assigned in chapter 1, and apparently it says it's due today. And if you have it done, that's fine. If you don't, finish it up and send it to me. Send it in an email. You can hand it to me, mail it to me, whatever you want. Whatever's quickest, that'd be great. I would prefer the typed, regardless, so that I can read it. It's very difficult to read different people's handwriting these days, especially these days. So, now we're going to spend the next 2 class days, today and Friday, discussing chapter 2. And chapter 2 is entitled The Engineer. And they asked questions like, what is an engineer? The very first question they asked. And we've already discussed that a little bit, and we're going to discuss it some more. So, living in North Platte now for 9 years, engineering has taken on kind of an interesting color for me. Engineering in North Platte gets confused a lot with train engineering, train engineers. Right? So what is a train engineer? Train engineer, of course, is the person who kind of sits in the cab of the train, cab of what do they call it? The engine, right? They sit on the locomotive or the engine, and they kind of work the controls in there, make sure things are going well. They do communications with the tower people if they're in the yard, and with other people if they're on the tracks, and with the switchers and all these things. So they're kind of in charge of making the train go, and they work together with their conductor, who is kind of in charge of the entire train as a whole. And so, years and years ago, 100 years ago or so, these kind of people were kind of like engineers in that they had a lot of understanding of the engine they were driving, and they did a lot of working on the engine that they were driving 100 years ago. Nowadays, no such thing. Nowadays, these people just sit in the cab, and that's all they do. And so the connection to engineering as we know it today is long since gone. It is no longer the case. Engineers on the railroads do not need any kind of science degree. They take a couple of training courses here at the college or at another college, and then they learn things on the job. It's not, you can go to that, you can get that job with a high school diploma and a couple months of training. certainly is not applying science in any way. And that's what engineering is all about. Engineering is about taking scientific understanding, scientific knowledge that has been accumulated over years and years and centuries and even millennia, and applying it in the real world to do something, to solve a problem, to fill a need, to change the world, really. And that's what engineers do. So, can scientists be engineers? Absolutely. Scientists are often engineers. Scientists often do the discovering of the ideas, the discovering of the scientific concepts, as well as the developing of these concepts into some kind of real-world application. I'm going to change this since I'm not using my computer yet. I will soon. Let's go to the source, lifeside. I think that'll send my picture out to the students instead of the computer screen. I don't know, maybe not. No, I'm trying to print it. Let's go to the source, try this again. Look at that, I'm supposed to take a nap. Yeah, there's no lights over there. I don't really get to see what is being sent out to my students, so I'm kind of letting them more heated. Like sending out my PC, I guess. I don't know if they can see me or not, because it doesn't really show me what they can see, so kind of confusing. So anyway, so what is an engineer? An engineer is this person who solves problems in the world using scientific, mathematical knowledge, but not just knowledge. That's a big part of it. But they also use a lot of technical skill, a lot of techniques, a lot of methods, I guess you could call them, that have been established, that are invented, that are developed for whatever particular thing. They also do a lot of they also use a lot of logic in what they do. So they're using logic, they're using methods. Logic, of course, being the making of decisions in an atmosphere where you have a place that you want to get to, you have some kind of result that you want to achieve, and you make decisions along the way that guide you towards that. And the idea of good logic is that you make as few choices in as efficient a way as possible to get to your goal. And bad logic involves making bad choices, many choices that lead you away from your goal, so you have to turn back around and try to get your goal. And that is something that happens in engineering all the time. It's something that they think about all the time. In fact, it is not just an engineering problem, it is actually a science problem. We make the correct decisions and we turn our path in the correct way to get to the intended result. We will talk about that. So, why do we have this need for engineering? One of the pictures that they show here, let's go ahead and switch to a new source since we can. Let's switch to my document camera here. And we'll look at some of the pictures they show which are relevant. One of the pictures they show here is, there's this nice picture of, I'm not sure if this is Neil Armstrong or Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin was the other astronaut to land on the moon with Neil Armstrong. Nobody really remembers him because he wasn't the first to step on the moon. But anyway, in this particular picture, are we illustrating a need, or are we illustrating a want or a desire, or are we illustrating something else when it comes to engineering? Going to the moon was a huge engineering feat. It required thousands and thousands of engineers and scientists, mathematicians, technicians, and hosts of other people to get it done. And it was done. And why? Why was it done? What was the purpose of it? Well, it kind of depends on how you define needs and wants, right? The thing that you want so bad that you can't consider living without it is a need. Right? And President John F. Kennedy made a promise that we would step on the moon first. Why did he make that promise? He made that promise because the Russians got into space first. And there was a big deal going on at this time. The United States was the first country to develop nuclear weapons, and it made them a superpower. Well, the Russians began developing nuclear weapons, and then they got into space first. And Americans were thinking, what's going to happen if they start dropping bombs down on us from space? We won't be able to shoot them down, we won't be able to defend ourselves. What happens is an all-out, nuclear winter or something. People were freaking out. And President Kennedy saw a need. He saw a need to establish the United States dominance in space and on Earth to keep the American people, to keep them feeling safe. I doubt that anyone would have been ever crazy enough to start a full-out nuclear war at that time. The Russians, although we have a hard time understanding the Russian people even today, they're not crazy people. They're not suicidal. They're actually much more conservative than we are by far. There was very little chance that was ever going to happen. However, the United States was growing, and they wanted it to continue to grow. And for that to happen, the United States needed to feel safe, needed to feel secure. And President Kennedy made that promise, and it was fulfilled. Not during his presidency, but during President Johnson's presidency. Was it Johnson, or was it? I don't remember who it was. But anyway, it was fulfilled later when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And it did really solidify America's dominance. Everybody has kind of forgotten since Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. Everybody in America has forgotten that the Russians were the first in space. We don't even think about it much. And it takes a nerd, really, to name the first satellite that went into space, Sputnik. It was Russian. It takes a nerd to name the first man into space. It was Yuri Gagarin, a Russian. Or even the first animal in space. I don't remember the name of it, but it was a dog, and it was Russian. Okay? So it's it did serve its purpose, and it was considered a need at that time. But what's really interesting about going to the moon was the result. We fulfilled almost a socio-political, global kind of political need of Americans and other people that were afraid of the Russians or afraid of the USSR at the time, Europeans in particular. But in so doing, as we went through this humongous project of going to the new moon, we had to invent so many other things out of necessity. So many different technologies, so many different methods, so many different engineering processes, so many world-changing things happened during that time. And it was completely due to the fact that we were deciding to do this huge project that some people thought was ridiculous. And some people still think is ridiculous. And yet the same people that think it's ridiculous and thought it was ridiculous are taking advantage of the very things that this program gave us. So what are some of the things that this program gave us? Well, the obvious one that I think a lot of people mention is Velcro. Velcro was invented during the space program. And it wasn't invented necessarily by a NASA engineer, but it was perfected and developed and made available to everyone shortly after it was starting to be available to everybody in the late 60s, early 70s. And it has become, of course, a very important part of our culture in a weird way. We use Velcro everywhere. If you were growing up in the 70s and the 80s like I was, the first shoes to use Velcro fasteners were so cool, and I got a pair of them they were called Roos, kangaroos. They had a little pouch in them too. They were super cool, and but Velcro is of course used throughout hospitals. It's used it's used so many different places. It's just insane, and we don't even think much about it. We don't think about the technology behind Velcro, but yet there are several technologies, several inventions, and several methods that were invented to make Velcro reality. But there are many others. food preservation. Before the moon landing, food preservation was a very different beast than it is now. And that wasn't that long ago, 50 years, less than 50 years, a little bit less. But, you know, World War II, post-World War II, pre-World War II, food preservation was all about metal cans or glass jars. And that's pretty much the only way we preserve food. If you were a soldier in Korea and you were eating the rations that were left over from World War II, which is what the Korean soldiers ate for the most part, you were eating things that were canned bread, canned cake, canned peaches, canned meatloaf, canned potatoes, canned everything. Everything was in a can, and when you opened the can, the food came out shaped like the can. Had the ribs of the can in it, and it was a big gelatin mess like the can. It was just everything came out in the shape of the can, even the peaches. It was really amazing. But everything was that way. Food preservation was only about canning. It's all you could do. If you wanted tomatoes and it was December, too bad. You didn't have them unless you were living in California. California, Florida, and some of the southern states were the only places where you could get produce year-round. If you wanted a salad and you were living in Massachusetts, too bad. You just didn't have it. And you could go some places that had a greenhouse and you could buy this stuff, but it was extremely expensive. Extreme. We're talking a head of lettuce would cost 100 times more than it would normally cost. So, you know, if it costs $1 a day, which is about what it costs you $100. So only the very rich could ever afford to eat produce in the winter. Everyone ate canned produce. Everyone ate canned peaches. Everyone ate canned beans, canned tomatoes, canned everything in the wintertime. And it wasn't that long ago. We're talking people are still alive today in this town that lived in that time. But when we sent people to the moon, we had to think of different things. We couldn't send canned food up there. Cans are heavy, and you have to carry them there, and you have to carry them back. And we don't want heavy things on space flight because every little ounce counts when you're going into space. So that had to change, and also they were thinking, you know, even at that time they were thinking, well, we're not going to just travel the moon and back. We want to travel further into space. Traveling the moon and back was hard enough because it took several days. But they wanted to even go further. So they were already thinking of things. And this is the time when things like plastics were being developed, polymers. And polymers were invented over 100 years ago. Somebody Washington. His last name is Washington. I don't remember if it's Booker T or I don't remember the first name. But anyway, a guy from the South invented polymers from peanuts. And polymers from soybeans have been around for a long time. Polymers are essentially just long protein chains that they kind of stick together. They're kind of stretchy, and that's what plastics are made of. And to make the suits, they had to use plastics. They had to use plastics in many different parts of the suits. They had to use all kinds of different materials, and they had to develop them. Kevlar was invented about this time. Kevlar is a very strong kind of fabric that is used in many different things that need a lot of strength for a little bit of weight. Kevlar was one of the predecessors to carbon fiber. Carbon fiber uses a lot of the technology that was used to develop Kevlar, but it's a different fabric. So the space program opened the door for a lot of new things in our world that really changed our world dramatically. Also, while we were out there, we learned a lot of things. Just from being out in space, we learned a lot of things about space around us. We learned a lot of things about the Earth. We learned a lot of things about the atmosphere. We were taking measurements. We were doing experiments. We were doing things over and over again. And as we got to the moon, we started making measurements of the moon. We learned so much, and then we started developing that knowledge into practical things. So here is an invention that was invented out of need. It's called a trebuchet. It is a device similar to a catapult invented by the French. And unlike a catapult, there is no tension in stretchy bands of any kind. There's no tension in the arm because it uses gravitational differential, essentially, where you have a very heavy mass on one end of this arm, this lever arm, and it's very close to the fulcrum. And you have the object that you're going to throw, the projectile, very far from the fulcrum, and it's much smaller than the mass that's in the counterweight. And what this results in is the ability to throw something small very, very far with, this device. And it doesn't require the tension, so it doesn't put all the stress in the device, doesn't put all the stress in this thing that you would get normally. This is something that we will do in this class. We will build a trebuchet and test it and rebuild it and try to make it better. But this was a huge invention that came out of need for the French. The French were trying to defend themselves from the English and from the Germans and from other people, the Belgians and all kinds of other people. And many people had catapults. The catapult was invented almost 2,000 years before, or maybe not about that. And the catapult's been around for a long time. But catapults, they are limited. They can only throw things so far, and they get damaged just by throwing things because of all the stresses in the members of the catapult. This, not nearly so much, and you can make them essentially as big as you want as long as the throwing arm is strong enough to stand up to the object that you're throwing. And I've seen trebuchets that were, I've seen one on YouTube that was 100 feet high. Let's take a look at that. Let's go look at something. Why would the French need this? Why would this be a need? Well, once you have if you have an army sieging your castle, the likelihood of you withstanding that siege once they reach your walls and once they reach your gates is almost zero. And the French knew that. They figured that out. They were good mathematicians. They could do the statistics of that. And so what their objective was to stop the army before they ever got close to the castle. And the further out you can attack them, the further away you can keep them on average. And so they started creating these things. So let's look at this here. There's lots of great videos about trebuchets and lots of great images. So these trebuchets are trebuchets that people are actually building these days. There are big contests for these things, and you can see there's a ladder on the side. You get all the way up to the top. And, I mean, another advantage of the trebuchet is that you do not have to, it does not require nearly so much effort to reset the trebuchet back to its original position. Whereas a catapult, you usually had to really crank down on some big gears to stretch it back into place. This thing, you just grab onto this loop down here where your projectile goes and just pull it down by hand for the most part. You might need a couple people to do it, but it's not that big a deal because of the big long lever arm you've got there to pull it down. These ones all have these slings on the end that extends the leverage as they get, and it also extends the amount of force that they can apply to it as it whips around. These are similar to the ones that we'll have you build, these little ones. There are different kinds of trebuchets. Here you have a trebuchet that actually has some rolling wheels in it that make it a little bit more effective so that the mass falls down on some rolling wheels instead of being swung around. So there's lots of different designs for it. Let's look at a video. There's some good ones here. The world record trebuchet of Warwick Castle. This is, I assume, somewhere in Europe. Sounds like an English castle. So here this thing
components and usually fires around of some 15 kilos in weight at a speed of up to 150 miles an hour. Though it's actually capable of central axle.
So this one has a big wheel system for resetting it, which is fine.
If this is not wound back off, then once the trebuchet is fired, it will literally.
So let's see what it's doing.
It's locked off with a firing pin. And also
kind of dangerous to be down there around that arm. Well, it's set like this, but
the sling is then attached to the end of the fire.
I want to see it actually fire. They're just setting it up and putting the projectile in.
9, 8, 7, 6. And there it goes! 150 miles an hour. Death from above.
So they don't actually show you the projectile, but that's pretty impressive.
In the world.
It doesn't look like it's moving that fast, but the end of that thing is really moving. The end of the rope is really moving. And it can throw, these things can throw projectiles several hundred yards, several hundred meters. It's pretty impressive. There's one guy that threw, he threw a car with his trebuchet, threw a piano in a car. That one's kind of fun. I don't know if they've got that one here. One guy filled a piano with gasoline, cans of gasoline, lit them on fire and threw it. Kind of fun. Oh, here it is. Here's the car that he threw. Anyway, but this was invented out of a need to protect themselves, and they put their heads together and they said, well, you know, people are using these big rubber band kind of catapults to throw things. Can we think of a way to throw something that doesn't use that stretchy material? They were using leather, big leather bands usually, or big ropes, big twisted ropes made of leather or made of hemp or something. Well, here's the guy that did the piano on fire. But anyway, the point being is that as they thought it through and started testing things, they started to come up with this gravity-based kind of catapult, and they kept testing and they kept fiddling with it until they found just the perfect ratios of length and weight and the mass of the projectile and everything else. And it's quite an interesting engineering problem that they worked through. So we have needs, we have desires, we try to fill them using engineering in many cases. And how does this affect the world at large? Let's go back to this thing here. In this, at the end of this section, they talk about the global economy. And how does it affect the global economy? Well, the global economy is affected in many ways by engineering. When we go back to World War II again, it's actually a fairly good example. And we're going to compare and contrast what happened after World War II to what happened after these latest wars that we've gone through here in the United States. So after World War II, the United States went out into the world, not just into their own country, but into countries that they had fought with and countries they had fought against. We went into Germany, we went into Japan, we went into the Philippines, we went into China, we went all kinds of places to kind of fix things that had gone wrong. Some of those places kind of kicked us out right away. For example, Germany. The Russians wanted a big role to play in Germany since they're neighbors with Germany. And so we ended up kind of getting kicked out of there for the most part and just having a few influences there. Same thing happened in China, like in Shanghai. We were kicked out of there almost immediately. So were the British. But we did spend a lot of time in other places like Britain and Japan, the Philippines, and other places. And we ended up actually kind of taking charge of some places like Guam. And we rebuilt those places using engineering. We rebuilt them by building new factories in Japan. Japan had almost all of their factories obliterated at the end of World War II. They had no opportunities to build, no chance of building cars, no chance of building boats. Every single place that had machines in it for making things was just destroyed, and on purpose. But the United States almost immediately started building car factories for them so that they could have cars again, and other things like that. And what happened to the car industry post-World War II? Well, The United States was making cars in car factories that were 50 years or older, 50 years old or older. And Japan was now making cars in car factories that were brand new, built by our best engineers, and tooled up with our, with the latest stuff. And so Ford at that time, which was a big company, and GM, which was a big company at the time, and all the big American companies were making cars that were essentially outdated. And they kept making cars that were outdated all the way until the 80s. And Japan was making cars that were updated, that were brand new from brand new factories. And so Japan's car industry went on this huge rise. America's car industry went on this huge downfall, and it changed the world economy. Japan became one of the richest countries in the world, and America started to suffer. And by the time the late 60s came around, America was really falling apart economically. By the time the late 70s came along, we were in dire straits. We couldn't hold a candle to anyone. And it wasn't until car companies started to build new factories in America that our cars started to catch up again. And it's only been since the 80s. I think the first factory to do it, I think it was Ford actually. I think they were the first American car company to update their factory from their 100-year-old factory that they used to make Model A's in, and to make new cars in a new factory, and new designs, and new engineering, and new everything, was just, wow, it's amazing. Well, then the other companies followed suit because they realized they were going to be left in the dust, and now American cars are almost as good as Japanese cars, if not as good in many cases. But it took us almost 50 years to kind of catch up. That's just one example. There are countless examples of that after World War II. Now, we've been through several wars recently, and it tanked our economy. And our economy still is kind of tanked. We're trying to claw our way out of it. But how did we do it this time? Well, how we did it this time was not exactly through engineering. We didn't go out and build new factories for things we need, or build new, update industries for things that we need. We started just throwing money around at everything and at everybody, regardless of whether or not we needed them. A good example is GM. GM went completely bankrupt, not because they ran out of money, not because of anything else. It was because of pure and simple politics. They went bankrupt because the bigwigs at GM took all the money from the company and retired. Literally. That's literally what they did. And they had these huge golden parachutes, I'm going to get fired, but I'm going to make $10 billion in the process. And the laws of the United States make that okay. That's something that the laws of the United States have allowed for, and no president and no Congress has ever done anything about it, never tried really to change the laws for that. So they took all the money, then GM doesn't have any money to even pay to pay their employees, to pay their benefits, or to pay their retirement, because all that money has been walked off with essentially. It's happened so many times in the United States. Well, and that's not exactly how it works. That's just kind of a brief overview. For details, you'd have to do some more studying on your own. But I guarantee you'll have to dig deep to find the truth, because there's a lot of people lying about it out there. Anyway, the government came by and said, we need General Motors. Well, did we really need General Motors? Do we need GM cars to survive in this world, or even to get by in this world? No. There are so many car companies today, it's just ridiculous. And so many car companies that are the equal of, or by far the superior of GM. GM is not a bad company, but they are by no means the most essential company in the world. And so there was no real need, quote unquote, to do it. However, politically, there was a need, because people wanted to become president. This was happening right in the presidential election. Everybody was vowing they were going to fix things so that GM would survive on both sides of the aisle, both parties, and it was going to happen one way or the other. The government was going to step in and save a company that had destroyed itself through politics. And what does it cost the American people? Well, it's cost American people their largest debt of all time, the worst economy we've had through 10 years ever. We've never had a worse economy in the past 10 years than we've had now. and really the worst employment rates since the Depression, the Great Depression. In fact, they suspect, if they counted them properly, that they would be worse than the Depression. We have more people unemployed than employed in this country, is what they suspect. Is that what happened after World War II? Absolutely not. Just the exact opposite. The exact opposite happened in World War II. Engineering changed the world and made us the most prosperous nation, the nation that had most people working in the entire world, the most people contributing to the economy, and it built and it built and it built on itself and it built on itself and it built on itself until it was just unstoppable, except by politicians. And so it's quite amazing to see the stark difference in policies. If you put your money into building instead of your money into fixing things that were broken by you in the first place, you can make a real difference, and that's what engineering is supposed to do. So what kinds of different engineerings can we get into? Let's take a look here. They've got a whole bunch here that are kind of split up into different things here in a timeline. They start off here with physics, chemistry, and biology, kind of the three basic sciences. Really, I would actually put physics at the top and biology and chemistry underneath them. But I think biology and chemistry the biologists and chemists wouldn't like that. Because there is kind of not necessarily a hierarchy, it's more like an underarchy of sciences. The basis of all the things that we study in the universe is studied by physicists. They study the most fundamental sciences. And then every other science kind of branches out from those fundamentals. And physics is the most fundamental, with chemistry being probably the second most fundamental, and then the others kind of branching off from chemistry. Most of the other sciences branch off from chemistry, like biology. But anyway, how did this all work out? 3,000 years ago, the first kind of engineering to come about was civil engineering. And I would maybe argue that. I would maybe say agricultural engineering and genetics engineering were the first kinds, because 3,000 years before this, this is 3,000 BC, and 6,000 BC, we actually began cultivating crops. We actually began taking those corn things that we were talking about last time and making them better and better every year. The olive tree was domesticated around 6,000 BC. People were being domesticated. Animals were being domesticated at this time. The dog used to be the wolf, and the cat used to be, the wild cat or the bobcat or whatever else. And we started kind of domesticating these things many thousands of years ago. And so I would say genetics engineering is the first one. But from civil engineering, when we started building our homes and towns and roads and things like this, at 3000 BC and the pyramids and things like that, military engineering came from that about the same time, because once you start building up structures, then other people want to take them from you. And so you have to build structures that are meant to defend those structures. And you start building your structures so that they can defend themselves and all these things. So military engineering is a direct branch from that. And mechanical engineering, they put down here, but I would actually connect that to military engineering, because at first it was all about defense. Build a wall that'll protect you from animals. But then it was about building weapons so that you can attack. And weapons are almost always a mechanical engineering kind of thing. And then once we get into building things, objects, tools, and other things like this, we start to create materials. And they put materials engineering at about 2000 AD, or a little bit earlier, about 1800. But I would put it far earlier than that, because materials engineering includes things like bronze. Bronze was a metal that was used in, 500 BC or something like that, 1000 BC or something like this. And it is a mixture of two different elemental metals, or 3 or 4, depending on what you use. You use zinc and copper and other things. But as you mix these things together, it makes a metal that's very malleable, very durable, good enough for weapons. And even before that, people were making things like cloth. We were starting to weave cloth from plants and mixing the different plant fibers together and making new materials. So I'd say materials engineering probably goes in a lot earlier, agriculture engineering a lot earlier. And then they started putting in things like electrical engineering right in here about 1800, and that's about right. They first started really dealing with electricity in the 1700s, late 1700s, right around that time. Chemical engineering, and they put that here in the late 1800s, and that's about right. We didn't really start understanding the idea of chemicals, and anything that we'd done before that, we didn't realize we were doing what we were doing. It was just accidental. We didn't really try to develop it. It was almost like we considered it magical. We just started using, when they were using words like, what's that science where they tried to turn lead into gold, or not the pseudoscience? Can't remember what they call it.
Alchemy?
Alchemy, that's right, yeah. So alchemy was kind of the predecessor to chemistry, but they considered it more magical than they did scientific, and so they weren't following scientific methods. They weren't trying to necessarily fill needs, and it was really just a bunch of hogwash. However, eventually people came along and started to realize, hey, this is not magic. If we just use a little logic here, we can figure this out. And it turned into chemistry eventually. Aerospace engineering, they put it a fairly late date for me. They put it right around 1900, a little bit earlier. And I would put that quite a bit earlier with things like balloons. Balloons were launched as many as 100 years earlier than 1900. And then, of course, they throw in some of these things like computer engineering, nuclear engineering, and they put those in the 1950s. Nuclear engineering, I would agree with you. I would agree with them. The nuclear engineering was definitely a 20th century kind of thing. Computer engineering, not necessarily. I would probably throw that to the 1800s. In the late 1800s and the mid 1800s, and even before that, there were people that were inventing computers and working on the theories behind computers. They even were building them. And they were very simple computers, and very different than the computers that we deal with today, but they would do simple.
Definition you look at.
Yeah, well, you know, a computer is something that computes, as simple as that, right? And the first computing machine, I think, let's take a look at it, because they just rebuilt it recently.
I have one in my presentation for the next class.
Do you?
Yeah. The abacus.
You could think of the abacus, but this guy right here, so there's two guys that we've often mentioned, Charles Babbage and Conrad Zuse, and they made mechanical computers, and here is a recreation of this. No, I'm not going to buy a language. My neighbor had one. So here, this Conrad Zuse adding machine it actually had different things that would do different things, so different parts that would do different things. We're not the right thing. Let's go to my source. Yeah. So here, this is a 1941. His was built off of, and I'm hoping that they'll get to this other guy's thing. So his was designed as an electrical thing from a mechanical one. So they're not actually going to talk about what I want to. Let's talk about, let's see, and this one is, I want to look at the Babbage. Let's look at that one. And there's one even earlier than that, so here's one that they have going on New Zealand. It's like, so you can see that it's actually a big mechanical device, and there was one even earlier than this. So Charles Babbage was 1837, I think they said there. And you can see it's a mechanical device that has these rotating discs in it. And there was actually someone before this guy, and let's look at one more here. Because it was just me, it was designed completely out of wood. I can't remember who designed it. John Graham Fowler, is that who it was? Reproduction of early mechanical, 2. Anyway, I can't remember who it was that it was. They discovered this invention and then somebody rebuilt it recently. And they actually made it work, which was amazing. It's probably this guy here, but I don't want to watch the video, we're out of time. But these things have been around for a long time. And of course, as time goes on, we have more and more engineering fields branching off of these early engineering fields. And they list several of them here and talk about, what they do, what different engineers do. And that gets us through all of Chapter 2 that we're supposed to do today, which we're doing Chapter 2.1 to 2.5, essentially. And then we're going to finish up Chapter 2, 210 to 212. If you do have homework, make sure you get working on that. Make sure you finish up any homework that you have not finished so far. And we will see you guys again on Friday. I know this bookwork seems a little bit drab and boring. You got to get through it. You got to do some bookwork, so it seems like a class. And then we will start our project soon enough. I do need addresses for anyone who is doing this by the podcast or distance learning. Please send me an email with your addresses so I can send you the kit if you haven't done that already. Even if you have done it, send it again just so I for sure have it, because I'm not sure if I've received any emails from students with their mailing address. I need to send you some materials, so please do that. Have a good one.